watching this free video tutorial, which is a free sample from our course Comprehensive Introduction to Corona for 3ds Max. It is a massive 9-hour long course in which we explore all the aspects of Corona for 3ds Max thoroughly. Make sure to visit our website mographplus.com and check the entire course out. In this lesson, we'll learn about volumetrics and SSS section of the Corona material. Subsurface scattering, or SSS, simulates the effect of light entering an object and scattering beneath its surface through its volume. Not all light reflects from a surface. Some of it will penetrate below the surface of an illuminated object. There, it will be absorbed by the material and scattered internally. Some of this scattered light will make its way back out of the surface and become visible to the camera. This is known as subsurface scattering, or SSS. Subsurface scattering is necessary for the realistic rendering of materials such as marble, skin, wax, milk, fruits, honey, and so on. In the scene, we have this dragon model, a backdrop, and a few corona lights. If we start the interactive rendering, the key or the main light was placed behind the dragon model so we can see the scattering of light through our subject much easier. In the material editor, we have this default corona material applied to the dragon model. Let's come down to the volumetrics and SSS section. And here we have two subsurface scattering modes, volumetric scattering and subsurface scattering. Subsurface scattering mode is for simpler materials that have a defined opaque surface and do not need any refraction or translucency contribution, such as wax, bone, marble, and stuff like that. Notice when the mode is set to subsurface scattering, refraction and translucency parameters become grayed out and unavailable. On the other hand, volumetric scattering mode is for more complex materials that, in addition to subsurface scattering, require refraction and or translucency, like orange juice, like honey, like caramel, some fruits, chocolate, and stuff like that. For now, let's set the mode to subsurface scattering, and down here in the subsurface scattering section, we have a bunch of parameters that become available when the mode is set to SSS: amount, radius, and scatter color. Our material, as you can see from the preview and in the render, only has a diffuse contribution, no reflection or refraction. Using SSS amount, we can decide on how much subsurface scattering we want our material to have. So if I set it to 1 to get the full subsurface scattering effect, now we are set to control how exactly the SSS effect will look using the radius and scatter color parameters. Scatter radius controls the radius of light scattering in the material. Smaller values cause the material to scatter less light and to appear more diffuse-like. Higher values make the material more translucent. Radius here basically controls the radius of the area each sample affects. Higher values will smooth the appearance of the subsurface scattering, and increasing the radius value can radically change the appearance of the material from looking like leather to marble. When we increase this value, we allow the rays to scatter further beneath the object and therefore seeing stronger SSS effect. So if we set the radius to 5 centimeters, (10 centimeters), 20, 40, 80, and 160. You notice by increasing the radius, the light rays are allowed to scatter further beneath the surface and we get a smoother effect. Let's set it to 40 centimeters for now. Then we have the scatter color, which determines the color that is visible in the shadowy parts of the object, or the color of the scattering effect if you wish. So it really depends on what you want to create and what's the shader that you're looking for. And then you need to choose a proper subsurface scattering amount, color, and radius. For example, if we want to create a shader for a green cartoony character, first I would change the diffuse color to a green color. Let's say with the RGB values of 30, 128, and 58. Now I'm going to copy the diffuse color to the scatter color and change the color values a bit to 75, 128, and 40 as our RGB values. I'm going to change the radius to something like 20 centimeters. And obviously this radius parameter really is scene dependent, so maybe 20 centimeter works here, and in another scene you would need something like 40 centimeters or 2 centimeters. We probably want to have some reflection, so let the set the reflection levels to 1 and glassiness to something like 0.7, and let's see what we get. And here is our lovely little green dragon. Let me rename this material to, I don't know, something like Green Dragon SSS. Now we can create a brand new corona material and assign it to the object and start the interactive rendering again. This time let's create a marble shader. First, load this texture called marble_01. And as I know the dragon model doesn't have any good UVs, I'm gonna first put my marble texture through a corona triplanar. Set the scale to 250 centimeters. I'm gonna change the blend amount to 0 because I don't want the projections of these textures from different sides to get blended together on that sharp cut. Because the texture actually allows us to do that because of its nature. I'm going to connect the map, the triplanar, to the diffuse color. Change the subsurface scattering mode to SSS. And subsurface scattering amount to probably 0.75 because I want to have a bit more effect from my diffuse contribution, so we don't want to use the subsurface scattering of 1 in this case and for this particular shader. And let's set the radius to something like 10 centimeter. I'm going to change the scattering color to a slightly less saturated orange with RGB values of 255, 110, and 76. But make the map to contribute only 25% to the overall scattering color. Okay, now let's see what we get. And here is our marble shader. We can work on the exposure and highlight compression to make the material look better. Okay, that's it. And we can name this material marble SSS or something like that. You can see higher resolution renders of this shader in the render output folder of the project files for this course. For now, we can stop the render. Now let's talk about volumetric scattering method. We can start with a new material and assign it to our geometry. In the volumetric scattering section, there are a few parameters that you should be very familiar with them from the volumetric effects lesson in the lighting section of the course when we talked about corona volume material. Actually, instead of assigning a corona volume material as your global volume material, you can zero out the opacity of a normal corona material and assign it as the global volume material and start adjusting the parameters in the volumetric scattering section. At the beginning of this lesson, we talked about how this mode differs from the SSS mode. Volumetric scattering mode is for more complex materials that, in addition to subsurface scattering, require refraction and or translucency, like orange juice, like honey and caramel, some fruits, chocolates and stuff like that. You notice when using the volumetric scattering mode, unlike the SSS mode, refraction and translucency are still available. If I start to adjust the parameters to see some volumetric scattering in our object, for example, set the distance to something like 5 centimeters and scattering color to a blue color with the RGB values of 54, 120, and 210, you notice nothing has changed in the render. To see volumetric scattering, you need to have translucency and or refraction values bigger than 0. So if I set the translucency fraction to 0.5, now we start to see that blue volumetric scattering happening. If I zero out the translucency fraction and set the refraction level to something like 0.5, again, we start to see the blue volumetric scattering with some refraction. Let's set the refraction level to 0. To see the raw volumetric scattering without any refraction or translucency, you can zero out the opacity level, which turns the surface completely transparent and allows us to see and adjust the volumetric scattering. Absorption distance controls how quickly the light passing through an object will become colored and darker. With a lower value, the light will be very quickly absorbed and so appear more strongly colored and darker, even with thin pieces of the material. With higher values, the light will travel farther through the material before these effects happen, so that even thicker pieces of the material will not show so much coloring and darkening of the light. So if I set the distance to 2 centimeters, we get a very, very dense volumetric scattering effect. And if set to something like 50, the volumetric scattering becomes much thinner, much lighter. Absorption color is the color that the white light will take after passing through the material by the absorption distance. Absorption color and absorption distance are mutual multipliers. So if I use a darker gray color, the scattering becomes denser, and if I use a lighter gray color, it becomes thinner. And obviously we can use any other color as the absorption color, and in combination with the scattering color, we can create very complex volumetric scattering effects. Let's try a greenish color, maybe a reddish color. Now set it back to the default mid-gray value. Then we have these 3 scattering parameters: scattering color, directionality, and single bounce only. Scattering controls the color of the scattering media. it affects the coloring of light bounced back towards the viewer by the volume of the material. Scattering color controls the color of the light after it is scattered. Let's try a few other color here. Now let's use our old blue color. Directionality controls the direction in which the light is scattered. The default of 0 means that light gets scattered evenly in all directions. Positive values like 0.8 means that light gets scattered forward along the same path it was already traveling. Negative values like negative 0.8, it goes from negative 1 to 1, and you should not really use very close values to negative 1 and 1. I would say go to negative 0.9 minimum and positive 0.9 maximum. And as I mentioned, negative values like negative 0.8 means that light gets scattered back along the path it was traveling. Let's set it to 0 for now. We have single bounce only. Once light has been scattered, it is still passing through the volume and has a chance that it may be scattered again. By enabling this checkbox, light can only be scattered once, after which it will pass through the volume without further scattering, though it will continue to be affected by absorption. And this gives faster rendering, with the trade-off being a darker result and potentially less realism depending on how much the scattering affects the final shader. Let's disable it for now. If we go to the Corona material library from the Corona menu up here, in the basic SSS section and liquid section, you can find tons of Corona materials that have been developed using either the SSS mode or the volumetric scattering mode. If I go to this basic SSS section and assign this jam strawberry material to the Dragon and load the material in the material editor and start the render, you notice how they have used a combination of refraction color, absorption, and scattering colors to create this complex looking material. You can study these materials to further familiarize yourself with these parameters and how to use them to get what you want. Now let's create a new Corona material and assign it to the Dragon model. I want to create a shader that I call it the Dragon shader. I've created this beautiful shader before using Arnold, which is another render engine, and here we want to try and create it using Corona. You can find that tutorial on our YouTube channel. If I load this render from the final material that we'll be creating, we want to create a shader that will look something like this. So first of all, let's set the opacity level to 0. Increase the absorption distance to around 4 centimeters. Change the scattering color to this bright pink color with the RGB values of 155, 92, and 161. Change the absorption color to a more saturated pink color with the RGB values of 176, 28, and 49. Increase the directionality to 0.8. Now we want to introduce some refraction. Before that, let's set the opacity level back to 1 so we can actually see any refraction contribution. Let's set the diffuse level to 0. Increase the refraction level to 0.7. Refraction glassiness to 0.6. And finally set the reflection level to 1 and reflection glossiness to 0.75. And for the reflection color, I'm going to use the same pink color as our scattering color. Now let's see what we get. And there you have this beautiful dragon shader. Let me stop the render for now. Next, let's try a shader from the Corona material library in another scene and see what we get. So open up the part 2 scene file for this lesson, which is another shader ball from masteringcgi.com.au. I'm going to select the shader ball and open up the Corona material library. From the basic SSS, assign this strawberry jam shader to the shader ball. Load it in the material editor and run the interactive rendering. Now we can kind of start to adjust the material a tad to get it closer to what we want. So we can study these materials, we can adjust these materials. So it's a very perfect library if you want to learn. I'm gonna just, I think the bump mode is a bit too much, so I'm gonna decrease it to about 1. Set the reflection glossiness to 0.9 and refraction glossiness to 0.6. We can decrease the distance to 2 centimeters and add a bit more directionality to the scattering. So let's use 0.3 as the directionality value, and let's see what we get. So as you can see from this preview render, really complex material can be created using volumetric scattering in the Corona material. I invite you to study all these subsurface scattering materials in the Corona material library to gain a better understanding of how these values work together to achieve the final result. In this lesson, we learned about volumetrics and SSS section of the Corona material library. See you in the next lesson. Thanks for watching this free video tutorial, which is a free sample from our course Comprehensive Introduction to Corona for 3ds Max. It is a massive 9-hour-long course in which we explore all the aspects of Corona for 3ds Max thoroughly. Make sure to visit our website mographplus.com and check the entire course out.